Ahoy, matey! Okay, that's the obligatory pirate greeting out of the way. Now, let's get technical. Okay, I never did a devlog after the first week of working on this. Sorry about that. I'm only finding time now to make it. Pirate games can be many things. They can be simulation-based, arcade, casual, or somewhere in between, as long as they are fun. And that's where this one finds itself, firmly in between. Why, you ask? Well, because I need to make sure that it's a blast to play. And in my opinion, mixing systems from different sets of playstyles and mechanics is a great way to do this. Let's get into the first devlog. Let's get into gameplay first. First up, ship controls. The controls are relatively simple. You use the usual WASD to steer the ship, and you can move forwards and backwards, but not sideways. That's how a ship works. There are two speed sets. One for when the sails are up, and one for when the sails are down. This ties into wind and the sail systems, so I'll get into that in a bit. You can rotate in any direction, similar to a normal ship. There isn't too much to say here other than it is working as needed and intended. Okay, now for my wildcard, the wind. So I had this idea that it would be really cool to add wind to the game and make the wind affect the ship and its movement. Through many hours of trial and error, I finally got it to work to a somewhat respectable level. It is far from being exactly how I want it to be, but hey, it works for now. Time management is vital in a challenge like this, so sometimes I'm going to have to be okay with not 100% finished assets and scripts, for the sake of the overall game. If it works, it works. So this is how it works. At a random interval of time between two set time limits, an upper and a lower limit, the game will instantiate an imaginary wind force. This force doesn't have a starting point, only a directional one. It can move in any direction on the X and Z axis, but not on the Y. We don't want the ship to be blown into the sky at an angular direction, so we ignore the Y axis. This force has a random strength chosen between two integers, again an upper and a lower limit. This strength determines how much force the wind exudes on the ship. So the wind can either be very strong, medium, or very weak. This creates a fun and challenging experience. So the ship then sees this direction and applies movement to a certain power, which is correlated to the wind's power in said direction. You have a set of sails, of course. That's how a ship works again. If the sails are up, you'll have a great speed boost when sailing with the wind, but a great speed hindrance when sailing against it. This isn't a simulation game, but it just gives it that extra layer of interaction. So in practice, it works like this. You are sailing along the shore, a heavy wind picks up and starts blowing you towards the shore. You now have to turn against the wind so as to not be blown against the rocks. You then do this by raising your sails, which in turn causes a massive loss of speed, but also nearly nullifies the power of the wind against your ship. You can now move against it, slowly. I realize that this is kind of complicated, but the short of it is, there's wind, which is cool. The wind is represented visually through an interface system that I've designed and made, which will show you visually the direction of the wind. Much like the ship's systems, this interface system is linked with the Wind Manager script and converts that data into something that can be represented visually. Only for this one, it does it in two-dimensional space instead of three-dimensional space. So I want the wind to affect things like flags, sails, plants, and maybe even the ocean. This will be extremely hard to do though, and might take a lot of time, especially in the case of the ocean. So let's talk about the sails. I have made some headway here as the wind does actually affect the sails on the ship. Only when there is a wind force active do the sails start shaking. The sails don't need too much more functionality other than that really. It also has animation, but it's really simple. It's only a simple rig using a couple of bones. When the player interacts with the button to switch the sails will then either lower or raise. visually and in the code for the wind. A lot of the information about the sails I've already talked about in the previous section of this devlog, so I won't get into it too much more here and add too much more here. So let's talk about combat. I've been working hard on combat, but the combat still needs a lot of work. The idea is there, but in execution it just isn't that fun. I think I've overcomplicated things a bit, to be honest. Right now how it works is that you have a number of cannons, and each cannon can shoot individually. The number of cannons that you have is scalable within the code, so that you can always upgrade the ship to get more or sell some cannons and have less. This makes sense for if I ever wanted to make it a real game where your ship would be upgradable and changeable. So how the combat works at the moment is that I have divided the area around this ship into 4 sectors. Each sector is represented by a red mesh, which is sort of like a viewport, sort of like a cone coming out the sides of the ships and the front and the back. And this becomes active only when the player's mouse is over it, the mesh that is. This represents that the player is within combat range and the combat area and will shoot within that range. In the future, this mesh would be smaller or bigger based on the player's ship stats like shooting ranges and so forth. So when the player clicks somewhere within the highlighted area, the cannons on the side of the ship where the player has clicked will then shoot in the direction of the click within the attack range and area. This works for the sides of the ship as well as the front and the back, which both have just 1 cannon right now. On the sides, you can have up to 12 per side on each. The system works, but fundamentally it feels more like a simulation style shooting mechanic than it does arcade, which is more of the theme of this game. It sort of feels like driving a tank and shooting out of a tank in a sort of simulation style game. I will probably look at changing this into something simpler in the future, but for now, as long as it works, that's good enough, given the time constraints I have set up for the demo. Right now, the ship shoots cannonballs that destroy themselves on impact with the water and instantiates a particle effect for the water. These will obviously do a lot more in the future and be a lot more advanced. Okay, let's talk about the camera. Right now, the game has a pretty basic camera, but to be honest, a game like this doesn't need much more. The camera follows the ship with an offset and a smoothing modifier. That's really all there is to it. The player has some input options, such as scrolling to change the viewport size, although right now it is done by lowering and upping the camera's physical position in 3-dimensional space on the Y and Z axis, so as to keep the original distance from the ship on the Z axis itself. All of this might change drastically in the future, but that's how it works for now and it's okay. I will most probably also introduce rotation at some point, so that the player can orbit around the ship to see the ship itself from all angles and the world around it. Now, the visuals. So, as you can see from the gameplay so far, the game has a very simple cartoony style. This was naturally done intentionally. A game like this, in my opinion, needs to be colorful, fun and vibrant. So that's what I'm trying to achieve. So, the art style. The game has a low polygonal art style, similar to games like Superhot, The Last Tree and any other game using assets similar to those that Cinti Studios create. I have made these assets myself though, as is the rules of the challenge, and I've also made my own polygonal asset packages on the store, on my own Unity asset store if you want to check those out. The game uses a single atlas texture for each asset to create its own UV space from, which is incredibly lightweight. This game would run on a calculator. So, what about optimization? This game might well be one that would be playable on lower-end PCs, web browsers, or even mobile devices. As such, it's important to keep optimization in mind. The camera has a relatively limited viewport, which helps a lot with culling and hiding assets from the player. Of course, with zooming this can change, but that's where occlusion comes into play. The reality is that with a game like this, you don't need to do too much optimization work. as there just isn't that much on screen at any given time, and the shaders that I'm making are all really lightweight. As long as your programming isn't too messy, the performance should be alright. So what am I doing for post-processing? I don't have time or probably the ability to program my own post-processing, and so I've chosen to go with Unity's built-in system. That's all there really is to say. Yay bloom and color grading, yay. Okay, shaders. I am by no means a shader programmer and have previously only really dabbled in it once or twice, so this has been an awesome challenge and learning curve for me. To get this cartoon style working correctly, we need some decent shaders, and remember, I need to be the one to make them all. I'm not exactly the best shader programmer in the world, so there are a lot of issues and improvements that still need to be made. A game like this needs to be lightweight and easy to run, and so I've had to implement some nifty tricks to make it look good but still run well. So first up, the ocean shader. So this one took the most time by far and was the hardest to make. I also learned a lot doing it. Right now, it isn't exactly where I want it to be in terms of visuals, but I think it's getting there. So a bit of technical speak. The shader uses some basic functions that you would expect, like smoothness, noise, reflection, and so forth. The reflection in the water also has a noise generated over it that somewhat distorts the reflection of the sun and clouds, making it a bit more visually realistic for an ocean. What I've done that I think is quite interesting though, is I've set up two main texture channels and then blended between them with a timer. This causes the texture of the water to change over a preset period and has proven to be an extremely performant way to get some decent looking waves. I really like it. Other than that, the shader also generates its own waves, but these are quite basic and lacking at the moment. They also need a lot of noisiness added to them, but I'm struggling to get it to work correctly. I then also introduced a tint feature so that I can make the water look darker and lighter based on whatever my needs are at a given time. For instance, during the day the water might be very blue and at night quite black looking. Okay, then flags and sails shaders. Generally just a cloth shader really. We've already spoken a lot about the flags and sails and how they work, and there isn't too much more to be said on that front. This shader basically creates a ripple effect in the cloth with some noise over it. It also has a scaling property to allow me to change the magnitude by which the cloths being affected are deforming. The deformation happens on all three axes in three-dimensional space. The shader is already tied into the wind system, which is a big feat for me. The shader only animates when the wind is active, so when there's a gust of wind, the sails will look like they are waving, and when there is no wind, they will die down and not move at all. So the foliage shader. Right now, the foliage shader is really just a cutout shader. It's pretty basic. And it isn't even really working that well, but I have a lot of plans for it. At the moment, I'm having some sorting issues with the layers for the shader that I'm trying to sort out. It needs to have some unique properties, one of which is deformation when the wind is active, but not in the same way as the sails, more in a root movement sort of way. This is doable, of course, as I've already achieved it with the flags and sails shaders. I believe this will create a realistic vibe for the game, where the nature corresponds with the wind in terms of deformation magnitude. Level design and general modeling. Okay, let's talk a bit about the level design in the demo so far. Let's talk about the assets I've been working on and how they will fit into the world. First, the main island. So, right now there is sort of like a big island, and then a few smaller islands and rock formations surrounding it. Any pirate game needs a shoreline and some sort of beach, and that's where this comes into it. Right now the shores are pretty barren, But the idea is that they will have a bunch of towns and other interactable locations along the shoreline. The island itself is quite a simple model. I generated height maps randomly until I got something that I liked. Then I went into Blender and used the displacement modifier to get the extrusion effect to create the island. Then I exported it into the game and used the height map as its main texture. To do this, I simply unwrapped the island in Blender using a simple cast unwrap. Then I manually painted over the height map to create the sand and grass-like textures you see the island having now. It was a really simple but effective process. This sort of process will work when you have simple assets that use simple UV spaces and don't need a lot of texture. But if you want detailed, realistic textures, this process won't work for that. Okay, then, the rocks and the trees. So any piece of land needs foliage. Foliage in nature is things like rocks, trees, plants, grasses, bushes, and so on. Any natural occurrence is really just foliage. Well, up to a point, I guess. Right now, I only have a handful of palm trees and some simple rock formations, but this will become more complex and plentiful in the future. These were all made pretty quickly in Blender. Expect a lot more in the next few weeks. Now, the ship. The ship is sort of the whole focal point of the game. Well, that's the idea. If the game were a full game, the ship would be the center point. For now though, it's pretty basic. Obviously the mesh looks decent and the ship is functional, but a lot more needs to be done with it. Whether or not upgrading the ship will be part of the demo is not yet known, as that depends on the allotted time at that point, but that would be an amazing feature to add eventually. As for now, the ship is looking pretty good and working okay, so that's good enough. Then onto the particle effects. At the moment, this is a very limited and basic setup. There isn't much to say. I have an effect for the water under the ship, one for cannons colliding with the water, and one for cannons being fired. That's it for now. Of course, eventually I would love to add a lot more. These all look and act serviceably and are adequate for now. Finally, let's talk about audio. There is none yet, lol. So, what's next? Well, for now, I go back to work. I have to churn out 3 more of these within December, and it's a shit ton of work, so I need to get to it. We are halfway to Christmas in the month. If you enjoy the content, I would really appreciate a follow and a like. Please, sir, or ma'am. I am planning to make this either a free asset or just a paid asset for my Unity asset store at the end of the demo, in terms of both the demo and the assets themselves. So if you're someone that would want to learn from this or just copy it and churn out a quick game, let's be honest, then stick around and check out what I have planned in a few weeks. As we approach the festive period, I plan to churn out a lot more content in the next few weeks. Thanks for watching. Until next time, keep sailing.